3 out of every 4 men who climbed into a Stuka cockpit during World War II never came home. Let that sink in for a moment. A 75% mortality rate. If you were assigned to a Stuka squadron, you were statistically more likely to die than survive. These weren't just numbers on a casualty report. They were sons, fathers, brothers who climbed into an aircraft that transformed from Germany's most feared weapon into a flying death trap. In 1939, the mere sound of a Stuka attack sent entire armies into panic. That distinctive wailing siren, the Jericho trumpet, announced death from above. Polish cavalry units broke and ran. French soldiers abandoned their positions. The psychological impact was so devastating that some defenders surrendered rather than face another Stuka assault. Newsreels showed the aircraft diving almost vertically, releasing their bombs with terrifying precision, pulling up at the last possible second. The Stuka became the symbol of blitzkrieg, unstoppable, terrifying, invincible. By 1943, that same aircraft had become a suicide mission for its crews. Pilots dreaded their assignments. Ground crews watched their comrades take off knowing many wouldn't return. The Stuka squadron suffered catastrophic losses, entire units wiped out in days. Some pilots refused to fly the aircraft, accepting court-martial rather than certain death. What had once struck fear into enemies now brought dread to those ordered to fly it. How did this happen? How did Germany's most successful tactical bomber become a death sentence for its crews? The answer lies in a fatal combination: an aircraft designed for a specific type of warfare, political leaders who refused to accept reality, and the rapid evolution of air defense technology that turned yesterday's predator into today's prey. This is the story of the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, and the thousands of men who died because Germany kept flying it long after it should have been retired. The Stuka story began in the early 1930s when the German military was rebuilding itself in secret violation of the Versailles Treaty. Luftwaffe planners studied World War I's lessons and concluded that close air support, aircraft working directly with ground forces, would be crucial in future conflicts. Traditional horizontal bombing from altitude was notoriously inaccurate. Even experienced bombardiers struggled to hit specific targets from 10,000 feet. The Germans wanted something different, an aircraft that could destroy bridges, fortifications, and armored vehicles with precision. The solution was dive bombing, approaching the target in a steep dive that made aiming vastly more accurate. The concept wasn't new. American aviators had experimented with dive bombing in the 1920s, but creating an aircraft specifically designed for this mission required solving significant engineering challenges. Diving at high speeds created enormous structural stresses. Pilots needed to pull out from dives that generated forces approaching the limits of human tolerance. The aircraft needed to remain stable and controllable while plunging earthward at angles exceeding 60 degrees. Junkers Flugzeugenmotorenwerke took on the challenge. Hermann Pohlmann led the design team that created the Ju-87, and the resulting aircraft was distinctive and ungainly. Fixed landing gear with large fairings, spats the crews called them, created additional drag but reduced maintenance and reduced weight. The inverted gull wing configuration positioned the landing gear attachment points optimally while keeping the propeller clear of the ground. Dive brakes beneath the wings solved a critical problem. Without some method of controlling speed, the aircraft would accelerate dangerously during the dive, making the pullout impossible and accurate bomb release nearly hopeless. The perforated dive brakes created drag that limited terminal velocity, allowing pilots to maintain control throughout the attack run. The prototype first flew in 1935, and testing revealed a stable, controllable dive bomber that could consistently hit targets from steep angles. The Luftwaffe ordered it into production, designating it the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, short for Sturzkampfflugzeug, literally dive combat aircraft. Early models carried a single 500-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage and could accommodate 4 50-kilogram bombs under the wings. The crew consisted of pilot and rear gunner, seated back-to-back in a long greenhouse canopy. Armament included 2 forward-firing machine guns and a single rear-facing gun for defense, minimal protection that would prove tragically inadequate. But the Stuka incorporated one feature that made it unforgettable: the Jericho trumpet. Small propeller-driven sirens attached to the landing gear fairings produced a distinctive wailing scream during the dive. This wasn't accidental, it was psychological warfare. The sound announced the attack, spreading panic among ground troops who had seconds to find cover before bombs started falling. The Stuka received its combat debut during the Spanish Civil War, where German volunteers of the Condor Legion tested equipment and tactics. The aircraft performed brilliantly against Republican forces that lacked effective anti-aircraft defenses or fighter cover. Pilots refined their techniques: roll inverted, pull through to establish the dive angle, align the fixed sight on target, hold steady through the scream of wind and sirens, release at the computed altitude, pull hard on the stick to recover. Spain proved the concept. The Stuka could destroy point targets with accuracy no horizontal bomber could match. German military planners watched and concluded they'd found the perfect weapon for supporting armored advances.
September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and the world discovered what blitzkrieg really meant. Panzer divisions punched through defensive lines, while Stukas ranged ahead, destroying anything that might slow the advance. Polish command posts, artillery positions, bridges, railroad junctions all became targets for precision dive-bombing attacks. The psychological impact exceeded the physical damage. Polish soldiers learned to fear the distinctive inverted gull wings and the terrible scream of diving Stukas. The sirens triggered panic, causing troops to abandon positions even before bombs started falling. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as the wailing announced another attack. Polish air defenses were minimal. Obsolete fighters and sparse anti-aircraft guns couldn't protect ground forces. Stuka units operated with near impunity, flying multiple sorties daily. Losses were negligible. Pilots returned enthusiastically, reporting destroyed targets and minimal opposition. The Luftwaffe had found its perfect weapon. The campaign lasted just weeks, ending in Poland's defeat. German military analysts studied the results and concluded that Stukas had been decisive. The aircraft entered military legend as the flying artillery that made blitzkrieg possible. France, in 1940, reinforced this reputation. As German armored columns pushed through the Ardennes, Stukas struck French defensive positions with devastating effect. At Sedan, where German forces crossed the Meuse River in a critical breakthrough, Stukas flew continuous attacks against French artillery and fortifications. The bombardment broke French resistance, allowing engineers to construct bridges for tanks to cross. Veteran Stuka pilot Hans-Ulrich Rudel later described these early campaigns as almost effortless. Opposition was scattered and ineffective. Flak, anti-aircraft fire, was light and poorly aimed. French fighters occasionally appeared, but were usually driven off by German escorts. Stuka squadrons suffered minimal casualties while destroying enormous quantities of enemy equipment. The evacuation at Dunkirk demonstrated the Stuka's capabilities against massed troops. Thousands of British and French soldiers crowded the beaches, waiting for ships to carry them to England. Stukas attacked the beaches and harbor repeatedly, killing hundreds and sinking numerous vessels. Only poor weather and determined RAF fighter resistance prevented complete catastrophe. By June 1940, when France surrendered, the Stuka had become Germany's most famous weapon. Newsreels showed the dramatic dive-bombing attacks. Propaganda emphasized the aircraft's precision and the terror it inspired. Nazi officials promoted the Stuka as a symbol of German air supremacy.
What nobody publicly acknowledged was that the Stuka successes had occurred under nearly ideal conditions. Opposition had been weak or non-existent. Air defenses were inadequate. Fighter resistance was sporadic. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies, allowing vulnerable dive bombers to operate freely. These conditions wouldn't last. In July 1940, Germany turned its attention to Britain. The Luftwaffe's mission was to destroy the Royal Air Force and soften British defenses for a planned invasion. Stukas would attack radar stations, airfields, and coastal defenses, targets requiring the precision that only dive bombers could deliver. The situation was fundamentally different from previous campaigns. Britain had prepared its defenses extensively. An integrated radar network provided early warning of incoming raids. Fighter squadrons stood ready at dispersed airfields. Anti-aircraft batteries protected critical targets. And British pilots were defending their homeland, highly motivated and increasingly experienced. The first Stuka raids revealed the problem immediately. British fighters, Spitfires and Hurricanes proved far more aggressive and capable than anything German pilots had faced. The RAF didn't wait for bombers to reach their targets. Fighters intercepted formations over the channel, breaking up attacks before they could begin. Stukas required time to set up their bombing runs, rolling into a dive, stabilizing, aiming, releasing ordnance, and pulling out consumed precious seconds during which the aircraft was extremely vulnerable. The steep dive meant pilots couldn't see behind them. Rear gunners tried to protect the aircraft, but a single rifle-caliber machine gun couldn't deter a determined fighter pilot. British fighters discovered they could simply dive on attacking Stukas and shoot them down with minimal risk. The Stuka's fixed landing gear and dive brakes created drag that made it slow and unmaneuverable. Maximum speed barely exceeded 240 miles per hour, pathetically slow compared to fighters that could reach 350 or more. Even loaded with bombs and fuel, a Spitfire could easily overtake and destroy a Stuka. August 18, 1940 became known as the hardest day among Stuka crews. Raids against RAF airfields encountered fierce resistance. British fighters tore through Stuka formations, shooting down aircraft faster than escorts could respond. Some Stuka groupings lost more than half their aircraft in single missions. Pilots who survived described flying through flaming wreckage of their comrades, watching aircraft tumble from the sky, trailing smoke and fire. The losses were insustainable. Within days, the Luftwaffe withdrew Stuka units from the Battle of Britain. The official explanation mentioned necessary maintenance and rest. The reality was that continuing to fly Stukas against British defenses meant accepting catastrophic casualties for minimal results. This should have been a warning. The Stuka had encountered a prepared enemy with effective fighters and integrated defenses, and it had been massacred. The aircraft's fundamental limitations, slow speed, poor maneuverability, inadequate defensive armament, became fatal liabilities against competent opposition. But German leadership learned the wrong lesson. Rather than recognizing that the Stuka era had ended, they concluded that the aircraft simply needed better fighter escorts and more careful target selection. The myth of Stuka invincibility remained intact in propaganda, even as pilots understood the truth.
June 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military operation in history. Stuka units participated from the first day, and initially conditions resembled the early Blitzkrieg campaigns. Soviet air defenses were in disarray. Fighter units were scattered and poorly coordinated. German forces advanced rapidly, with Stukas providing crucial close air support. Hans Ulrich Rudel, who would become the most decorated German serviceman of the war, flew his first combat missions during Barbarossa. He described destroying Soviet tanks, artillery positions, and command posts with near impunity. Soviet fighters occasionally appeared, but were often obsolete types flown by inexperienced pilots. Rudel and his comrades racked up impressive tallies of destroyed vehicles and equipment. But the Eastern Front was vast beyond German imagination. Distances that seemed manageable on maps translated to hundreds of miles of terrible roads, endless forests, and harsh terrain. As German forces pushed deeper into Soviet territory, supply lines stretched and air support became spread thinner. Soviet defenses improved rapidly. New fighters like the Yak-9 and La-5 began appearing in larger numbers, flown by pilots who learned quickly from early defeats. Anti-aircraft defenses multiplied around critical targets. The Soviets deployed enormous quantities of AA guns, creating defensive belts that Stukas had to penetrate. Winter arrived with savage intensity. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Aircraft became difficult to maintain. Engines wouldn't start, hydraulics froze, metal became brittle. Pilots flew in conditions that made every mission an ordeal. Frostbite was common. Engines failed from cold. Visibility through snow squalls approached zero. Stuka losses climbed steadily. Aircraft that survived combat often crashed from weather or mechanical failures. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training, sent into combat before they'd mastered the aircraft. Experienced pilots watched new crews die on their first or second missions, victims of Soviet fighters or ground fire they never saw coming. The Stuka's vulnerability became increasingly apparent. Soviet ground forces learned that concentrated rifle and machine gun fire could bring down dive bombers during their attack runs. Entire infantry companies would fire at diving Stukas, creating walls of lead that even armored aircraft couldn't always survive. Many Stukas were shot down not by fighters or flat guns, but by massed small arms fire from troops on the ground. By 1943, flying a Stuka on the Eastern Front meant accepting odds that grew worse with each mission. Some squadrons suffered 50% casualties within weeks of arriving at the front. Replacement aircraft and crews arrived only to be ground down in turn. The attrition was relentless and unsustainable. Yet German command kept the Stukas flying. The aircraft could still destroy tanks and fortifications when they reached their targets. Commanders argued that close air support remained essential for ground operations. The Stuka was the only German aircraft designed specifically for precision ground attack, and no replacement was available. So the missions continued, and the casualties mounted. As losses spiraled, Luftwaffe engineers attempted modifications to improve survivability. Additional armor protected crew positions and critical components. The rear gunner received twin machine guns instead of a single weapon. Still inadequate against fighters, but better than nothing. Some aircraft received cannons beneath the wings for tank busting, creating the Ju-87G variant that Hans-Ulrich Rudel famously flew. These modifications helped marginally, but couldn't solve fundamental problems. The Stuka remained slow, unmaneuverable, and vulnerable. Adding armor increased weight, further degrading performance. The aircraft designed for precision attacks in 1935 couldn't compete with 1943's reality. Tactics evolved out of desperation. Stuka units abandoned the steep dives that had been their hallmark, instead attacking from shallower angles that exposed them for less time. They concentrated operations in sectors with good fighter cover, refusing missions without adequate protection. They increasingly flew at dawn and dusk, when reduced visibility gave some protection from interceptors. Nothing really worked. Soviet fighters grew more numerous and aggressive. Pilots learned to orbit above German airfields, waiting for Stukas to return low on fuel and ammunition. Easy kills for fighters that could dive on exhausted crews trying to land. Some Stuka pilots were shot down within sight of their own airfields, killed after surviving their missions. The psychological toll was immense. Pilots watched friends die with numbing regularity. Ground crews prepared aircraft knowing the men flying them probably wouldn't return. Replacements arrived young and terrified, having heard stories about Stuka casualties. Some experienced pilots refused to fly with new crews, believing inexperience made survival even less likely. Morale collapsed in some units. Pilots developed sudden illnesses before missions. Some crews deliberately damaged their own aircraft to avoid flying. Sabotage that could result in execution if discovered, but preferable to certain death over enemy territory. Officers struggled to maintain discipline as men calculated their odds and found them unacceptable. By late 1943, the Stuka was being withdrawn from the most dangerous sectors, relegated to quieter areas where opposition was lighter. But quieter was relative.
Even secondary fronts featured competent Soviet forces with adequate air defenses. Stuka crews continued dying, just in different locations. The final terrible irony was that Germany had developed a replacement, the Focke-Wulf FW-190, which proved highly effective in the ground attack role. Fast, maneuverable, well-armed, and capable of defending itself against fighters, the FW-190 could accomplish everything the Stuka did while offering crews a reasonable chance of survival. But production priorities and military politics meant Stukas kept flying long after better alternatives existed.
By 1944, the Stuka had become obsolete everywhere except in German propaganda. Yet crews continued receiving orders to fly the aircraft against targets defended by overwhelming air superiority. The Western Front after D-Day was particularly deadly. Allied fighters roamed freely, shooting down any German aircraft they encountered. The Stuka squadrons that remained operational were shadows of their former selves. Experienced pilots were dead or transferred to other units. Replacements had minimal training. Aircraft were worn out from years of operations, maintained by exhausted ground crews with inadequate parts and supplies. Some units operated with barely enough aircraft to form a proper formation. Missions became increasingly desperate. Stukas attacked Allied columns at night to avoid fighters. They operated from improvised forward airstrips, moving constantly to avoid being caught on the ground. Losses from accidents, crashes, forced landings, mechanical failures rivaled combat casualties. The statistics tell the grim story. Of the approximately 6,000 Stukas built during the war, most were destroyed in combat or accidents. Luftwaffe records show that some Stuka-Gruppens suffered over 100% casualties, meaning every pilot and rear gunner in the unit was killed, wounded, or captured, and their replacements suffered the same fate. The 75% mortality rate among Stuka crewmen exceeded casualty rates for German U-boat crews, which were themselves horrific. Some of the final Stuka missions occurred in early 1945 as Soviet forces pushed toward Berlin. Depleted squadrons flew against overwhelming odds, their attacks barely noticed among the massive battles consuming Nazi Germany. Aircraft that had once terrorized Europe were now regarded as target practice by Allied and Soviet fighters. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, only a handful of operational Stukas remained. Most had been destroyed in combat or abandoned as the Luftwaffe collapsed. The aircraft that had symbolized Blitzkrieg's power had become a monument to institutional failure and the cost of refusing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. The Stuka story offers harsh lessons about military aviation and institutional thinking. The aircraft was brilliantly designed for a specific tactical situation, attacking poorly defended targets with precision while enjoying air superiority. In those conditions, it performed superbly. But those conditions disappeared by mid-1940, and the Stuka never adapted. German military leadership, particularly Hermann Göring and other Luftwaffe commanders, bore responsibility for continuing Stuka operations long after the aircraft became obsolete. Pride, propaganda requirements, and refusal to admit mistakes combined to keep a death trap aircraft in service years after it should have been retired. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of young men climbed into Stuka cockpits knowing their chances of survival were minimal. Some died on their first missions. Others survived dozens of sorties through luck and skill before their odds ran out. The 75% mortality rate meant that assigning someone to a Stuka squadron was tantamount to a death sentence. The Stuka remains famous in aviation history, but for the wrong reasons. It's remembered for its early successes and distinctive appearance. The newsreels and propaganda photos show diving Stukas with their sirens wailing, symbols of Nazi military might. The reality was far darker. The Stuka was an aircraft that killed most of the men who flew it, not through any particular design flaw, but because it was kept in service long after the tactical situation made it suicidal to operate. It stands as a cautionary tale about institutional inertia, the cost of propaganda over reality,
and the price paid by soldiers when leadership refuses to acknowledge that conditions have changed. 3 out of every 4 Stuka crewmen never came home. Each of those deaths represented not just a personal tragedy, but an institutional failure, a system that valued appearance over reality and allowed politics to override military necessity. The Stuka's legacy isn't its early victories, but the thousands of graves marking the cost of those who flew it after it should have been grounded.